At 0640 hours on August 23, 1944, a column of 12 M-four Sherman tanks from the United States 4th Armored Division rolled through the milky morning haze west of Écouves Forest in Normandy. The air smelled of wet clay and cordite residue from the previous day's shelling. Engine heat shimmered above the rear decks, mixing with the low fog that clung to the hedgerows like a second skin. On paper, the mission was simple: advance 8 miles, secure a crossroads, and screen infantry movements pushing north. In practice, Lieutenant Charles Avery's platoon faced a problem not written in any operations order. They had no map. The tank commander's map case had burned during a mortar strike the afternoon before. The platoon sergeant's spare had dissolved into a gummy pulp after a night of Normandy rain seeped through his turret hatch. Radio contact with battalion headquarters was unreliable, fading in and out with static like distant thunder. They moved through contested terrain with only partial knowledge of where friendly lines ended and where German patrols began. And the only man who understood the maze of local farm lanes and logging roads, Private First Class Henry Hap Collins, the driver of the lead Sherman, could not read a military map even when one was available. Not a single officer in the platoon could explain how Collins managed to navigate. He was 21 years old, thin-shouldered, soft-spoken, with the perpetual squint of a man judging sunlight angles rather than landmarks. He had grown up driving logging trucks in rural Kentucky, long before he ever saw a uniform. There, dirt roads twisted through hills with no signs, no coordinates, and no predictable logic. Collins learned them by curve tightness, by slope grade, by the smell of pine on one side and damp creek soil on the other. Direction, to him, was not a compass reading, but a feeling transmitted through steering, through the flecks of tires on gravel, through tree-lined silhouettes shifting across a windshield. During training, he failed map reading tests repeatedly. Grid coordinates eluded him. He mixed up true north and northeast with the same frequency that other recruits misplaced spare socks. Once, during an exercise in Louisiana, he rotated his map 90 degrees and guided an entire training platoon directly into a swamp. Instructors marked his file with the notation "geographically unreliable." But inside a tank, with the M4's radial engine vibrating through the hull and dust boiling behind the tracks, Collins possessed something no classroom exam could measure: an orientation instinct, sharper than doctrine. He could choose between forks in the road with instantaneous certainty. He could recall terrain he had seen only once, under fire, in rain. Officers called it guessing. Crews, after months of watching him arrive precisely where he said he would, called it something closer to black magic. That morning, Collins's supposed magic met its most unforgiving test. German remnants of the 277th Infantry Division were regrouping east of Écouves Forest. Intelligence estimated 1 weakened battalion. In reality, 2 full Kampfgruppen were assembling for a counterattack supported by Panthers, Stugs, and infantry elements, nearly 60 armored vehicles, and over 500 men. Their chosen attack corridor, by coincidence or by fate, overlapped the same unmarked farm lanes that Avery's platoon now crept through. Inside Avery's turret, the doctrinal risks were obvious. Blind armored movement in confined forest terrain invited disaster. Panthers could kill Shermans at ranges the Americans could barely detect targets. A single wrong turn could funnel the entire platoon into a kill zone, with no room to reverse or maneuver. Yet Collins insisted on a series of turns that no map, had one survived, would have suggested, left at a sunken lane nearly invisible beneath overgrowth, right past a collapsed stone barn half swallowed by ivy. straight through a narrow ridge cut where only inches separated the Sherman's tracks from the root-tangled embankments. Each decision was made without hesitation. Collins navigated not by reference points, but by terrain feel. The grade under the hull, the spacing between hedgerows, the way dirt changed color where heavy traffic had worn the surface. It was instinct weathered into something almost mechanical. What Collins could not know, and what battalion staff failed to grasp, was that this improvised route placed Avery's 12 Shermans directly across the axis of the German counterattack before it formed. Had the platoon followed the original planned road, they would have missed the German thrust entirely and left the infantry exposed. Had they chosen a parallel lane, they would have collided with Panthers already deployed in firing positions. Instead, through a chain of unplanned turns, chosen by a man who could not read coordinates, the platoon was about to intersect the German column at its most vulnerable moment, while still in march formation, armor aligned nose to tail, flanks open, guns forward, situational awareness low. A hum reached the Sherman crews first, not loud but steady, the subaudible resonance of heavy tracks on firm soil. Collins, hands light on the controls, slowed of his own accord. He raised 2 fingers to Avery, a silent signal meaning wait. 30 seconds later, the platoon heard it. The metallic growl of Panther engines, growing louder, approaching from the southeast through a gap between hedgerows. Avery climbed halfway out of his turret and froze. Through morning haze, he saw silhouettes. Tall, angular, confident. Panthers advancing in column. The wrong turn had become an ambush. What followed unfolded in minutes. An accidental interception turned deliberate assault. A platoon that doctrinally should have withdrawn stood its ground. Shermans that should have died in the first exchange instead crippled a force 5 times its size. And at the center of it all was a tank driver who had failed every written navigation test the Army had ever given him, yet whose instinct, in one decisive morning, altered the tempo of an entire corps-level advance. This is the story of how a man who could not read maps reshaped a battle by reading the land, and how intuition, dismissed as luck, became decisive doctrine in the final year of the war. The Panthers were not supposed to be here yet. According to the last reliable intelligence brief Avery received, time-stamped 0540 hours, the German counterattack was forming near Haze, nearly 6 miles east. But intelligence in Normandy aged quickly. German units moved at night, regrouped in pockets, slipped through gaps in American observation. The battlefield shifted in increments too small for staff officers to see and too large for platoons to ignore. What Avery's Shermans faced that morning was not a disorganized remnant, but a coordinated thrust. The Panther was designed for this ground. 75 millimeters of high-velocity K42 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from over 1,000 yards. 80 millimeters of sloped plating made every incoming round behave like it had struck a polished shield. The silhouette was low, the turret narrow, the optics German precise. Panthers thrived in open fields, but in Normandy's hedgerow country, they were even deadlier. The bocage provided natural firing lanes like pre-built fortifications. A Panther hull-down behind a hedgerow could dominate an entire valley. In the previous 72 hours, Panthers from the same Kampfgruppe had destroyed 17 American tanks. 5 at one crossroads, 4 during a failed flanking attempt, the rest scattered across farm lanes that had turned into coffin routes by noon. Every after-action report carried the same grim sentence. Panthers saw us first. Panthers fired first. Panthers hit first. Blind movement in this terrain invited death. Avery knew the doctrine. Shermans were never meant to fight Panthers head-on. Standard operating procedure was clear. Avoid confined spaces, maintain spacing. allow tank destroyers to engage heavy armor from distance. Yet doctrine required preparation, reconnaissance, and maps, none of which the platoon still possessed. In normal operations, scouts would advance, radio contact would confirm routes, artillery observers would adjust fire. But nothing about this morning was normal. The platoon was effectively cut off, navigating terrain as convoluted as a maze. Every hedgerow hid a possibility: an ambush, an anti-tank team, a machine gun nest, or nothing at all. The absence of information was itself a threat. And Collins's instincts, miraculous as they often seemed, came with no explanation the officers could articulate. You could not write a field order that read, "Follow the driver who feels the ground." You could not justify combat decisions based on intuition. Yet here they were, turning when Collins tapped the hull, slowing when he raised a hand, accelerating when he muttered something about the soil being too stiff for Germans to ignore. To Avery, it felt like gambling. But the alternative was paralysis. As the fog thinned, the platoon rolled into a narrow cattle lane hemmed in by hedges nearly 8 feet high. The sun, still low, cast long shadows that pooled in ditches like ink. Branches scraped the hulls. Visibility dropped to mere yards. Gunner Lewis muttered into his intercom, "Feels like driving into a rifle barrel." No one disagreed. Shermans were at their weakest in such corridors. Their armor offered no advantage. Their ability to maneuver was reduced to a single axis. A Panther encountered in this lane could fire one round, immobilize the lead tank, and trap the entire column, turning 12 armored vehicles into 12 stationary targets. Avery considered ordering a halt, considered reversing the column and trying another route. But the ground behind them was no safer than the ground ahead. And Collins had not hesitated once. He drove like a man answering a question no one else heard. The real problem, however, was unfolding beyond the next rise. 2 German Kampfgruppen, far larger than Allied intelligence believed, were aligning for a coordinated strike toward the American infantry pushing north of the forest. German staff officers, desperate to restore a broken front, intended to use their armor as a hammer to shatter the advancing line before it consolidated. Nearly 60 armored vehicles, over 500 infantry, anti-tank guns, mortars, machine gun teams. If the Panthers reached the crossroads before the Shermans did, the result would be a massacre. Infantry pinned, supply routes severed, and the broader corps-level advance delayed by days. But no one in Avery's platoon knew this. The battlefield picture available to them was fragmented, reduced to engine echoes and tire ruts and the faint tremors of distant movement transmitted through loose Normandy soil. Only Collins felt the full shape of the threat. At a fork in the lane, he slowed again, not abruptly, but with the steady deliberation of a man comparing the weight of 2 unseen futures. Avery asked for a report. Collins simply said, "Left." No reason offered, no explanation given. Avery's loader, Corporal Haskins, whispered, "Lieutenant, if this turns wrong, we'll be boxed in." Avery answered, "If we stop, we're dead." The Sherman turned left. 2 minutes later, the faint resonance of Panther engines rolled across the lane like distant thunder. 2 minutes after that, silhouettes emerged through the haze. German armor in march formation, unaware that 12 American tanks had cut directly across their intended line of advance. What doctrine defined as suicide had, through a sequence of unplanned instincts, become opportunity. And the problem that had threatened to cripple Avery's platoon, no maps, no recon, no navigation, was about to place them in the exact position required to dismantle a counterattack 5 times their size. Private First Class Henry Hap Collins did not look like a man who would alter a battle. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighed 140 pounds, and carried himself with the quiet posture of someone who preferred engines to people. He rarely spoke above a murmur. He never volunteered opinions during briefings. And yet, inside a Sherman, nothing escaped him. Every vibration transmitted through the hull registered as information: soil density, track bite, rutted ground, distant movement. Where most drivers steered by sight, Collins drove by feel. Born in rural Kentucky during the lean years of the 1920s, Collins grew up surrounded by logging roads that curled through valleys like tangle lines on a map no one ever bothered to draw. His family owned one truck, one old battered gearbox, one route into the hills. Henry learned those routes before he learned long division. He learned the difference between red clay and wet loam by the sound tires made. He could tell if a road veered left or right long before he saw the curve, purely from wind direction and the angle of sunlight cutting through treetops. In the Army, none of that translated into test scores. He failed his first map reading exam, then his second, then his fourth. Instructors rotated him through remedial classes until they ran out of patience. He inverted north and northwest so frequently that one sergeant joked the only safe direction to send Collins was straight home. His test sheets returned with red pencil scrawls: incorrect grid, improper coordinate scaling, map orientation reversed, non-compliant route logic. Yet every time Collins sat behind the controls of a training tank, officers noticed the same pattern. He arrived at destinations faster than drivers who aced every written test. He took obscure dirt tracks instructors did not remember adding to the exercise map. He guided tanks through dense Louisiana brush without snapping a single antenna. He navigated night routes by the pitch of wind through cypress leaves. And when questioned about decisions that seemed impossible to justify, Collins offered the same soft-spoken explanation: it just felt right. Most officers dismissed the answer as unhelpful. A few dismissed the man as unreliable. But Lieutenant Avery saw something else: consistency. Collins never demanded credit, never exaggerated, never guessed with bravado. He simply sensed direction the way other men sensed temperature. In the platoon, Collins became an odd paradox: the driver who could not read maps but never got lost. Corporal Haskins once recorded a story in his journal. During a training run near St. Lo, the platoon commander ordered a halt. The map showed a creek ahead, impassable terrain. Collins quietly said, "Sir, the creek's dry this time of year." Avery asked how he could know that. Collins said, "Ground feels hollow. Tracks aren't sinking." They continued. The creek bed was indeed dry. Haskins wrote, "It is like he hears the ground talking." As the war dragged through hedgerow country, such instincts became less curiosity and more necessity. Collins developed a reputation: the man who could thread a 30-ton tank through pathways barely wider than a jeep. The man who could reverse a Sherman down a slope in pitch darkness without rolling it. The man who stayed calm under fire because, to him, chaos simply meant more signals to interpret. Still, his gift came with limitations. Collins could not articulate the reasoning behind his choices. He could not brief a route. He could not reproduce explanations for battalion staff. His navigation was not transferable. It existed only in the moment, inside the hull, with hands on levers and feet on pedals. That morning, west of Écouves Forest, those hands burned faintly against the metal controls. The soil had changed, slightly firmer, slightly more compacted. Collins recognized it instantly: ground pressed by weight, multiple heavy vehicles moving in column. Not fresh, but recent. He tapped twice on the hull, signaling slow. Avery trusted the signal blindly. Not because doctrine told him to, but because every time Collins tapped twice, something happened. A patrol, a mine, a roadblock, a hazard that intel never predicted. Collins raised his eyes toward the tree line. The wind carried a faint vibration that did not match Sherman engines. Lower pitch, greater torque. He knew the sound. He had heard it once near Coutances. Panther engines idling before dawn. He did not say any of this over the intercom. He simply adjusted the tank's speed until the platoon settled into the same rhythm he sensed ahead, as if lining up to meet something moving toward them. To Avery, Collins's silence was unnerving. To Collins, words were unnecessary. The ground had already told him the truth. For 2 minutes they crawled forward, boxed between hedgerows like cattle in a chute. No one spoke. Loader Haskins wiped sweat from his palms. Gunner Lewis scanned the slit in the hedgerow to their right, seeing nothing but fog and branches. Then Collins did something he had never done before. He braked hard. Avery almost struck the turret ring. "Driver, report." Collins said only, "They're close." "How close?" Another pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Too close to turn around. Avery stared ahead into the haze. At first he saw nothing, then shapes emerged. Tall, angular, unmistakable. Panthers. And in that moment, Avery understood something critical. Collins had not brought them into danger. Collins had brought them to the one place where 12 Shermans could ambush 60 German vehicles before the Germans realized they had walked into a trap. A man who could not, read a single grid square, had just positioned the platoon to reshape the battle. For a moment, no one inside Avery's Sherman spoke. The silhouettes ahead were still blurred by haze, but their geometry was unmistakable. Tall glacis plate, narrow turret front, angular side armor. Panthers. Not one or two. A column. In doctrine, the correct response was clear. Break contact. Reverse. Create distance. Call for tank destroyers. Shermans were never meant to engage Panthers frontally at close range. To do so voluntarily was considered not bravery, but error. Every manual issued since 1942 stated the same instruction in different words. Do not fight the Panther on its terms. But Avery sensed something none of the manuals accounted for. The Germans had not seen them yet. The Panther column moved at march pace, engines rumbling in steady unison. The lead tank's turret was pointed down the lane, not sweeping. The following tanks maintained close spacing. Too close for combat, perfect for road movement. The German crewmen were not expecting contact here. They believed they had open ground ahead. They believed they were hours from American armor. Avery climbed halfway out of the turret, risked a longer look through the gap in the hedgerow. His breath caught. The Panthers were still adjusting formation, not yet deployed into fighting order. The second and third tanks had their hatches cracked, commanders scanning lazily, assuming safety. He dropped back into the turret and keyed his intercom. "Driver, advance 5 yards, slowly." Collins eased forward, barely nudging the controls. The Sherman crept until Avery could see the lane's geometry fully. If they reversed now, they would retreat into a blind curve. Deadly if the Germans accelerated. If they stayed, they might catch the enemy before he transitioned into combat posture. It was a decision point. "Lieutenant," Gunner Lewis said, "German optics will spot us the moment the fog shifts." Avery replied, "Only if they're looking." The defiance began with one sentence that violated every line of armored doctrine. "We're holding." No retreat, no regrouping, no waiting for orders from battalion headquarters that might never arrive through static, choked radios. Avery was committing 12 Shermans to a confrontation against a force they should not have survived. But the terrain, for once, favored them. The hedgerows formed natural walls, shielding the Shermans' flanks. The lane angled slightly upward, limiting the Germans' downward visibility. And most critically, Collins had placed them at an intersection none of the staff planners had marked. A choke point where the German column could not fan out, could not form a battle line, could not bring more than one gun to bear at a time. Avery turned to his crew. "Load armor piercing." Haskins rammed around into the breach with a metallic snap. Lewis swung the gun toward the gap. The turret hummed as the mechanism engaged. In the following Sherman, Sergeant Rowe whispered through his intercom, "Lieutenant, is this an ambush?" Avery answered, "It is if we fire first." But firing first required one more choice. Who would take the opening shot? Every gunner dreamed of the first strike. Every commander feared it. Too early, and the Panthers would fan out before the ambush matured. Too late, and the lead Panther would see muzzle flash before Avery's gun locked on. Collins made the decision for him. "Sir," he said quietly, "they're about to accelerate." Avery did not ask how he knew. The ground vibrations had changed. Subtle but unmistakable to Collins's feet, the Panthers were downshifting in unison, preparing to increase speed once they passed the curve ahead. If the Germans accelerated, the Shermans would lose their advantage. Avery keyed the platoon frequency. "All tanks, hold position. Do not fire until my command." Silence followed. The Panther column closed to 200 yards. Fog swirled above their hulls. The low sun reflected off their glacis plates like dull coins. 150 yards. 100. Gunner Lewis steadied his breathing. Sweat rolled down his temple. The M-four rocked slightly as Collins locked the brakes. 70 yards. The lead Panther commander finally seemed to sense something amiss. His turret began to rotate, slow, almost casual, as if correcting for a minor suspicion. Avery's voice cut through the intercom. "Fire!" The Sherman's 75mm gun recoiled with a violent jolt. The round slammed into the Panther's turret ring at a downward angle, an improbable shot made possible only because the German tank was still adjusting traverse. Sparks burst from the impact. The Panther lurched sideways, tracks grinding against the lane's walls. Rowe's Sherman fired next, then Sergeant Vickers. The confined lane amplified each blast into a concussive wave. The German column dissolved into chaos. The second Panther attempted to pivot, but hedgerows trapped its hull. The third braked hard, colliding with the second's rear armor. German commanders shouted orders that ricocheted inside steel walls. Their line had become a metal bottleneck. Avery gave the order, "Keep firing. Disable mobility." Shermans hammered track links, idlers, lower hull plates, targets vulnerable even to their less powerful guns. Within 60 seconds, 3 Panthers were immobilized. Within 90 seconds, the column's rear tanks began reversing blindly, colliding with stugs behind them. Avery did not celebrate. He simply keyed the intercom with the calm of a man who had already accepted the consequences. "Driver, forward 3 yards. Gunner, next target." It was no longer an ambush. It was an execution of terrain geometry carried out by a platoon that had no right to be here, and by a driver whose intuition had placed them exactly where doctrine never would. And the defiance that had begun with a single sentence, "We're holding," had now become irreversible. Lieutenant Avery did not need binoculars to recognize the silhouette ahead. The first Panther emerged through the thinning fog with the deliberate confidence of a machine designed to dominate. Its bow gun glinted. Its turret rotated with slow, mechanical certainty. Behind it came another, and another. A column, still in march formation, barely spreading out, their spacing tight, their flanks exposed. Perfect targets if the Shermans could fire first. But firing first required something no training manual had prepared them for, committing to a fight they had not been ordered to start. Avery hesitated for 3 seconds. In armored warfare, 3 seconds was the time between life and being scrap metal. Battalion headquarters had not authorized engagement. No artillery was registered on the lane. No tank destroyers supported them. They were 12 Shermans facing the vanguard of nearly 60 German armored vehicles. Doctrinally, withdrawal was correct. Practically, withdrawal was suicidal. The hedgerows behind them prevented rapid reversing. The corridor was too narrow for turning. A fallback would bottleneck the column and immobilize them under Panther fire. Collins understood this even before Avery spoke. He kept one hand on the transmission lever, the other on the steering levers. Waiting for the order he knew must come, Avery keyed the intercom. "All tanks hold. Load armor piercing." Corporal Haskins slammed a 75mm round into the breech. The loader's hands trembled, not from fear, but from speed. Gunner Lewis whispered to himself, the kind of muttered computation gunners used when visual references were scarce. Range, angle, turret offset. Avery raised himself into the commander's seat, eyes scanning the hedgerow to their right. A gap barely wide enough for a man, but wide enough for an idea. "Driver," Avery said quietly, "nudge 3 feet right." To Collins, the order was more than maneuver. It was permission. He eased the Sherman forward, letting its right track crunch through the thinnest section of hedge. Branches broke with soft cracks. Leaves rained onto the glass's plate. The tank's nose dipped slightly as the soil changed texture. The Panther crew, still unaware, continued forward. German march discipline kept the column tight. Their assumption was simple. The Americans had withdrawn south. No one expected American armor to be north of the intended attack route. Avery made his decision. "We engage." Across the platoon net, silence. Then a series of calm, clipped confirmations. Tank after tank acknowledging an order no staff officer had issued, and one that every commander knew violated the prescribed avoidance of heavy German armor unless overwhelming superiority existed. They had no superiority. They had surprise. Avery's experiment, the defiance that doctrine forbade, began with the smallest of tactical improvisations. Bring the gun tube to bear without revealing the hull. "Gunner, traverse 2 degrees left. Hold." Lewis adjusted the traverse handwheel with micro movements. The Panther's turret was still facing forward, scanning ahead for American infantry, not armor. Avery raised one finger, then brought it down. "Fire!" The Sherman bucked. The 75mm round crossed the lane in less than a second and struck the Panther's exposed lower side plate. Thin, poorly sloped, vulnerable. A flash. A plume of black smoke. The Panther's engine compartment ignited. The turret jerked. The tank slewed sideways. The German column reacted exactly as Collins had predicted, without ever stating it aloud. They halted. Panthers could maneuver only in open spaces. In the lane, they were boxed, constrained, forced to rotate turrets in place. An act that bought Avery's platoon seconds they desperately needed. "Second tank, target the next Panther. Same point of aim." Another Sherman fired. Another impact. Another plume of smoke. Avery understood the geometry now. The lane funneled the Panthers into a line, turning the German advantage into a liability. In a corridor barely wide enough for movement, the Panther's ability to pivot and bring its 75mm gun to bear became painfully slow. But the act of defiance had a cost. The third Panther recovered quickly. Its turret snapped toward the muzzle flashes in the hedgerow. The gun stabilized. It fired. The shell hit the embankment, showering the lead Sherman with dirt and stone fragments. Had the angle been 3 degrees lower, Avery's tank would have been gutted. "Shift! 4 feet left," Avery barked. Collins moved the tank, not wildly, not urgently, but with surgical precision. He felt the ground through the hull. He felt the embankment's firmness. He positioned the Sherman exactly where the Panther's gunner would not expect it to be when he reloaded. Gunner Lewis fired again. 3rd Panther, disabled. The German column buckled. Behind Avery, the rest of the platoon committed to the gamble. Tanks 2, 3, and 4 took positions behind hedgerow breaks Collins had pointed out hours earlier. Breaks no map had marked, no recon patrol had reported. This was Collins' experiment, using terrain memory as a weapon. His silent defiance of doctrine, turning hedgerows into firing positions, turning blind routes into advantages, now shaped every decision Avery made. Within 60 seconds, the Shermans had fired 10 rounds. Within 90 seconds, 4 Panthers were burning. Within 2 minutes, the German column had stalled, its momentum broken, its confidence shaken. The act began as improvisation. It was becoming deliberate warfare, and Collins, the man who failed every navigation test, had become the unspoken architect of the ambush. The moment Collins braked, the platoon's entire formation compressed into a narrow, silent line. 12 Shermans, nose to tail, boxed, between hedgerows barely wider than their tracks. A wrong place by every doctrinal standard. A death trap. Yet Collins did not reverse, did not angle for cover. He kept the Sherman still, engine low, hands resting lightly on the levers as if listening through them. Lieutenant Avery climbed halfway out of his turret and saw the silhouettes ahead. Panthers advancing in march order, unaware of the American presence. Their guns pointed forward, their commanders' cupolas scanning the distance, not the hedgerows. The German column assumed safety inside what should have been a protected axis of advance. Avery dropped back inside the turret and whispered into the intercom, "Driver, what are you doing?" Collins replied with the calmness of a man adjusting a truck on a logging road. "Sir, if we move now, they hear us. If we hold, they walk past us." The logic defied doctrine. Armor did not hide in confined lanes. Tanks maneuvered. Tanks kept distance. Tanks avoided being stationary where no pivot turn was possible. Yet Collins had made a decision that ignored every principle written since the first tank manual printed in the 19-teens. And Avery, by not countermanding it, became complicit. The platoon waited. 60 seconds, 90 seconds. The sound of Panther engines grew sharper, vibrating the hedgerow branches. Gunner Lewis steadied his 50mm sight. Loader Haskins whispered a curse. The smell of diesel mixed with the sweeter, colder odor of morning mist. Every crewman could feel the weight of German steel pressing toward them. Avery keyed his radio in a near whisper. "Platoon, button up, guns cold. Do not fire until ordered." A doctrine violation. Engagement ranges in Bocage country demanded first shot advantage. Yet firing too early risked revealing their position before the Germans fully entered the kill zone. Collins tapped the hull once, a signal Avery had never heard before. Not slow, not halt. "1 Panther length," Collins said. "What?" "They'll be 1 Panther length from us. That's when we hit them." Avery stared at the driver's periscope feed. "How do you know?" "Feel it," Collins said. "The ground's telling us." No manual could justify acting on words like that. No field officer could defend it in a briefing. Yet Avery understood something in that moment. The decision was no longer about doctrine. It was about survival. And Collins, inexplicable as his instincts were, had not misled them once since the war began. The first Panther's snout breached the hedgerow gap ahead, its cannon cutting a horizontal line in the mist. A beast of steel 70 tons in weight, armored like a fortress, designed to kill the very tanks that now watched it from mere yards away. Avery exhaled, then gave the order. Guns, ready. The platoon had no room for coordinated maneuvers, no space for flanking. They had only one tactic available: allow the Panthers to pass the hedgerow gap, expose their thinner side armor, and strike at point-blank range before the Germans could reverse or traverse turrets. It was an ambush conceived not by doctrine, but by a driver's intuition. The first Panther crept past the gap, treads grinding softly. Its turret turned slightly, but the gun remained forward, scanning deeper into the lane ahead. Not sideways, where 12 Shermans lurked silently. Avery spoke the command like a man cutting wire. Fire. Lewis squeezed the trigger. The Sherman recoiled. The 85mm round tore through the Panther's side armor, penetrating beneath the turret ring. A flash, a plume, a hollow metallic collapse. The Panther shuddered to a stop, smoke venting from its hatches. The second Panther froze. Crews shouted. Their column compressed, halting in confusion. One attempted to turn its turret, but turret traverse was slow at low engine RPM. A second Sherman fired. Another sharp metallic crack echoed through the lane. The second Panther's engine compartment erupted into flame. Germany's most feared tanks were dying within seconds because they had marched directly past a platoon that should never have been there, yet was exactly there because Collins had felt the terrain. Avery keyed the radio. All Shermans, execute. The platoon fired in sequence, each blast punching into steel hulls that had been exposed by the bottleneck. German commanders attempted to reverse. Engines roared, tracks tore into mud, but the narrow lane trapped them. They could not pivot, could not maneuver, could not bring their guns to bear. In less than 3 minutes, the lead of the German counterattack was crippled. Collins watched through his periscope and adjusted the Sherman a mere foot backward, 1 foot that repositioned the hull enough for Lewis to sight on a third Panther attempting to pull away. Hold her steady, Lewis said. Already am, Collins replied. Another round, another plume of smoke. Avery realized something unsettling. They were not improvising anymore. They were executing a tactic Collins had created without announcing it. A tactic born from terrain, intuition, and defiance of every armored warfare principle. And it was working. By minute 5, the German counterattack had stalled. The Panthers that survived could not advance without clearing the burning wrecks blocking the lane. Infantry could not bypass tank carcasses in time. Communications within the German column broke down as officers attempted to determine what ambushed them. All because a driver who could not read maps had read the ground too well. The defiance was simple, devastating, and irreversible. Lieutenant Avery had no written doctrine for what came next. The platoon's field manuals offered nothing for a scenario in which 12 Shermans had stumbled directly into the march formation of a far superior German armored force. The standard response would have been immediate withdrawal. Reverse, conceal, radios. For artillery, hope the Panthers did not pursue quickly enough to trap them. But Avery did not order a retreat. He watched Collins's knuckles on the tiller sticks. They were steady, not tense, not trembling, steady. Collins had braked at the exact moment the Panthers moved into view, as though he had known the moment would happen. Avery understood that the only advantage they possessed, surprise, would evaporate within seconds. "Driver," Avery said into the intercom, "take us forward 10 yards. Just 10. Collins complied without question. The Sherman crawled forward enough for Avery to bring his binoculars to bear. The lead Panther was less than 200 yards away, its commander still scanning the opposite hedgerow, unaware that an American platoon had effectively cut the column in half. Then Collins spoke, quietly, almost apologetically. "Sir, we can't let them deploy." Avery turned inside the turret. "Explain." Collins swallowed once. "They're bunched up, 2, maybe 3 behind the lead. Road's narrow. If they fan out, we can't stop them. If they stay in line, we can." It was not a tactical argument. It was a mechanic's logic. Battlefield geometry expressed as a simple truth. A panther in march formation was a target. A panther in formation dispersal was death. Gunner Lewis, hearing the words through the intercom, muttered, "Sir, he's right. If they splay out, we're finished." Avery made the decision in less than 3 seconds. "We hold this ground." It was not a heroic order. It was not dramatic. It was a precise calculation based on the only advantage they had. Retreat would guarantee destruction. Attack might delay destruction, holding the position, forcing the Germans to react within a confined lane, might buy survival. And Collins, for the first time that morning, took initiative without being told. He nudged the Sherman sideways into a shallow depression along the lane, aligning the hull so that the gunner's traverse had maximum left arc. It was a subtle shift, 2 feet at most, but it positioned the tank to engage whatever emerged first from the fog. Avery realized what Collins had done and whispered, "Good. Very good." The rest of the platoon followed instinctively. Tank after tank pushed into firing positions that were not doctrinal, not diagrammed, not coordinated by radio, but dictated by the one man who felt the terrain as if it were an instrument. "Loader, armor piercing," Avery ordered. "Up," Haskins confirmed. The air in the turret tightened. Sweat collected inside gloves. The engine noise seemed to lower in pitch, as if the Sherman itself understood what was coming. Then came the sound, a deep mechanical growl, rhythmic and heavy. Panther engines shifting from idle to acceleration. The column had detected movement. They had not yet identified the threat, but they were adjusting. "Collins," Avery said, "hold us here." "Yes, sir." The lead Panther broke through the fog completely. Tall hull, sloped glasses. Command cupola scanning left to right. Its barrel began rotating, slowly at first, seeking the disturbance it sensed. Lewis's breathing became audible inside the intercom. "Range, 200, maybe 190. "Aim low," Avery said. "Side of the mantlet. Fire when ready." Lewis did not fire, not yet. The Panther had turned slightly, exposing a narrow plate between the front hull and the right track guard. It was a vulnerability so small, most gunners did not bother trying. But Lewis whispered, "I see it." Avery said, "Take it." The Sherman recoiled. The shot cracked through the hedgerow, sending leaves spinning into the air. The round struck the Panther's vulnerable plate and punched through the internal track housing. Sparks erupted from beneath the hull. The Panther lurched sideways as its right track snapped. "Hit!" Lewis shouted. Not destroyed, but immobilized. The German commander ducked into his turret. Smoke leaked from the track well. The crew scrambled to orient the turret toward the Shermans, but Collins was already moving. Without order, he advanced 3 yards, just enough for the Sherman's gun to gain clear sight of the Panther's exposed side armor. "Aim for the turret ring," Avery said. Lewis did. The second shot cracked through the fog, a dull thud, a puff of black smoke. The Panther's turret froze mid-turn. "Panther disabled," Lewis reported. One tank, one narrow lane, one decision. The German column halted. Engines revved as the crews behind the immobilized Panther struggled to maneuver around it. But the lane was too narrow. The lead vehicle had become a roadblock. Avery saw the opportunity immediately. "We're doing this," he said. "All tanks, forward by bounds. Use the lane against them." No one questioned the logic. The platoon was not executing a planned ambush. They were improvising second by second, following the silent geometry Collins had created the moment he braked in that lane. 12 Shermans were about to fight 60 German armored vehicles. And the first Panther had fallen not because of doctrine or reconnaissance or luck, but because a driver, who could not read maps, had understood the ground beneath his tracks better than any officer could read a chart. Lieutenant Avery understood the geometry immediately. 12 Shermans in column, boxed by hedgerows, facing Panthers advancing in march order. In doctrine, this was retreat territory. Pull back, request artillery, avoid direct confrontation. But there was no retreat. The lane behind them was narrow, sloped, and flanked by high banks. Reversing 12 tanks under pressure would take several minutes. The Panthers would close the distance long before that. Avery keyed his throat microphone. "Platoon, hold position. Engines idle." The order violated every instinct. Sherman survived by movement, by changing angles, by refusing predictable silhouettes. But movement now meant noise. Noise that would echo off the hedgerows and announce their presence before they were ready. Collins's voice crackled through the intercom, barely above a whisper. "Sir, they haven't spotted us." Avery risked a look above his hatch rim. The Panthers were still forming, several hulls visible through breaks in the hedgerow, turrets locked forward, commanders scanning ahead, not sideways. March formation. Vulnerable. Avery exhaled once, slow. This was the window. "Gunner, orient to the opening. Loader, armor-piercing ready." Inside the cramped turret, the crew shifted with mechanical precision. Corporal Haskins slammed an armor-piercing round into the breech. Gunner Lewis adjusted elevation slow enough to avoid the screech that worn gears sometimes produced. Any sound now could collapse the opportunity. Panthers advanced steadily, their engines producing that heavy, deliberate resonance particular to German transmissions, less vibration, more torque. They were 30 seconds away from the lane intersection. Once they crossed it, their flank would disappear behind hedgerows, and the ambush geometry would vanish. Avery muttered, mainly to himself, "We either shoot first or die first." Collins spoke again, quiet but certain. "Sir, we have 6 seconds when the lead one clears the hedge." "How do you know?" "It's the rhythm." Avery had heard stranger sentences from Collins in the past. He did not question it now. The lead Panther grew larger in the vista slit. Angular bow, high glacis, long 75mm gun pointing dead ahead. As the tank reached the narrow gap where 2 hedgerows converged, something remarkable happened. Collins edged the Sherman forward exactly 2 feet. The movement was so slight it barely shifted engine RPMs. But it changed the angle of the opening, just enough for Lewis to see the Panther's turret ring and a sliver of its lower hull. Avery realized what Collins had done. He'd found the mathematical angle where a Sherman's gun could fire first while remaining nearly invisible until the last possible moment. "Driver," Avery said quietly, "hold that position." Collins' hands tightened on the levers. "Holding." The Panther entered the kill window. "Fire." Lewis squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared in the confined lane, dust exploding from the hedge walls. The recoil slammed through the turret. The round struck the Panther low on the hull side, exactly where German armor thinned to a vulnerable plate. The explosion threw sparks. The Panther lurched, slowed, and stopped. "Hit!" Haskins shouted. "She's dead!" But there was no time to celebrate. The second Panther accelerated, trying to clear the disabled lead tank. Its commander finally saw movement, finally realized Americans were in the lane. "Aim for the drive wheel," Avery snapped. Lewis swung the gun 3 degrees. Collins adjusted the Sherman half a foot to correct the firing lane. The second round left the barrel with a roar and slammed into the Panther's right drive wheel, snapping it into twisted metal. Tracks jammed. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the lane. 2 Panthers down in less than 15 seconds. Avery keyed his radio. "Platoon, execute static firing line. Do not move. Repeat, do not move." Static firing lines were not designed for Shermans. They were too thinly armored to trade blows. But Avery had recognized the geometry. The hedgerows forced German armor into a single vehicle file. Each Panther would appear one at a time, exposing its flank as it maneuvered around the wrecks. Shermans never received opportunities like this. Not in Normandy. A third Panther pushed forward, commander shouting orders. Its turret swung left, searching the hedges, not the lane. Lewis fired. The round hit the Panther's turret ring. Sparks erupted. The turret froze at a crooked angle. "3!" Haskins yelled. A fourth Panther halted behind the wrecks, finally realizing they faced an ambush. Its commander popped the hatch to assess the blockage. Lewis waited. Steady. The Panther commander rose. Lewis fired. The rifle-straight crack of the 75mm gun cut through the lane. The shot punched through the turret roof. The commander vanished from view. Avery's voice remained calm. "Next." For 30 seconds no one moved, neither American nor German. Then the Germans made their decision. They backed off. Instead of pushing through the kill lane, the column reversed, attempting to regroup and flank the hedgerow from another angle. Avery ordered, "Platoon, forward 10 yards, index guns right." Again, Collins moved the Sherman just enough, never too much, never too loud, always aligning geometry rather than following doctrine. What the platoon had done violated every page of armored warfare instruction. Shermans were meant to maneuver, not anchor ambushes. Drivers were meant to follow maps, not intuition. Platoons were meant to withdraw from superior armor, not confront it. Yet Collins's instinct, his act of defiance against maps, doctrine, and common sense, had just broken the first wave of a counterattack meant to halt an entire division. And the battle was only beginning.